Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this class, we're going to be looking at how to draft an unlined coat. This coat is made from a double-faced splittable wool fabric, which is why it doesn't require a lining. This is class 2 in a 3-part series, where I firstly started by showing you how to work with a double-faced splittable wool fabric. Now we're going to look at how to draft an unlined wool coat pattern. And then in class 3, I will show you how to sew and construct this coat. For this class, you will need to have a starting point, such as a bodice block that fits your individual figure. If you don't have access to one of these, then you could use a basic pattern, such as my Copen pattern, which I'll pop a link to in the description box below. So grab your starting point and we can begin. To draft this pattern, I'm going to start with a bodice block pattern. And my bodice block has approximately 4 centimeters, 1.5 inches of ease at the bust, waist and hip. I've chosen this as a starting point as I imagine that more of you have bodice block patterns compared to jacket or coat patterns that you can use as a starting point. My pattern here is in half scale. I will be giving you all of the measurements that I used for the full size pattern. We're going to begin working with the back pattern. So I'm going to separate my patterns. And I'm also going to add some extra paper onto the bottom of my back pattern, as I will need this length for the coat that I'm drafting. The first thing that we're going to want to do is to add some length to our pattern. Whether your pattern currently finishes at the waist or at the low hip, you're going to want to extend it to be the length of the coat that you want to make. Now, my coat from the centre back neck measures 126 centimetres, approximately 50 inches. My height is about 5'7" inches, 170 centimetres. I would recommend measuring the length on your body or taking a look at some existing garments in your wardrobe. Extend the centre back and extend the side seam in line with the low hip. Draw a horizontal line at the hem. If you don't have a low hip on your pattern, perhaps your pattern ends at the waistline, you can follow these steps for extending it. Extend your centre front line down from the waist. You can take a measurement on the side of your body from waist to low hip, or you can use an average measurement, which is approximately 8 inches, 20 centimetres. On a right angle to the centre front line, draw your low hip. Measure your individual low hip and add the ease for the pattern that you're working with. For my pattern, it would be adding 4 centimetres, 1.5 inches. Divide this measurement by 4 as we're working with 1/4 of the body. For my pattern, I would make the front larger than the back. I would add 5 millimetres, 1/4 inch to the low hip measurement for the front of the garment and remove that amount from the low hip measurement for the back. Connect to the waistline at the side seam. We're going to add a slight bit of volume into the hem of this garment in the form of an A-line shape. Find the centre of the hem and the centre of the low hip. Connect the two with a straight line. Using a pair of scissors, cut from the hem along the straight line until you meet the low hip line. At the low hip, cut from the side seam to the middle line, leaving a small amount of paper attached as a pivot point. Prior to opening up the A-line, it's a good idea to measure your current side seam from the low hip down to the hem, and take note of this. Then you can work to pivot the paper at the pivot point to open up the hem of the garment. Fill in the triangle insertion with a piece of scrap paper. I'm going to add 5 centimetres, 2 inches into the middle of this hem and tape it in place. Whatever you've chosen to add as your insertion in the hem of the garment, you're going to want to add half of this to the side seam as your extension. Because I added 5 centimetres or 2 inches, my extension is going to be 2.5 centimetres or 1 inch. I'm going to add a bit of extra scrap paper to my side seam because I will be increasing the ease there. I'm then going to draw my side seam from approximately the low hip area to that new extension point at the hem. Measure your new side seam and work out how much you've lost at the low hip due to the insertion of the A-line. You will need to add this amount back on at the side seam hem. We also want to remove an amount from the side seam hem to compensate for any bias stretch that might occur. I'm going to remove 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. So you will need to add back on the amount that you've lost and then remove this amount. This means that I'm raising my side seam by 5 millimetres, 1/4 of an inch. Use a shallow curve to connect your new side seam into the centre of your hem. Moving up to the top of the garment, we're going to move the high point of the shoulder away from the neck edge by 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to make my shoulder approximately 2 centimetres, 3/4 of an inch larger than my current shoulder. I have a back shoulder dart in my pattern. I'm going to ignore this dart, which will make my shoulder larger than my shoulder size. If you don't have a dart in the back of your pattern, you will simply want to extend the end of your shoulder. I'm also going to raise my shoulder by 2.5 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch. I will do this on the front and the back to add a little bit more ease here. Recurve your back neckline. Moving down into the armhole, we're going to increase the crossback a point approximately halfway in your armhole by 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to draw a line that is a right angle to my center back line in line with the current base of the armhole. I'm going to lower my armhole by 4 centimeters, 1.5 inches. I'm then going to work to increase the ease of this garment. I decided to add 4 centimeters, 1.5 inches ease to the side seam of my pattern. If you want to add any more than that, you would probably want to slash and spread the pattern in the center of the pattern. I'm going to add this amount all the way down the side seam, following the shape of my current block. I want the waist of this garment to still be a little bit accentuated. I don't want to have a straight waist area. So I'm following the curve, and I'm going to soften that waist curve slightly using my French curve. I'm not going to be using my waist dart, so I'm going to cross that dart out. Then you can use your French curve to redraw your armhole, connecting from the end of the shoulder to the cross back, and then curving from the cross back into that lower armhole. Pivot your French curve as required until you get a curve that you're happy with. Moving down to the hem of the garment, I'm going to connect the hem in a soft curve with that 4 centimeters, 1.5 inches of ease at the side seam. Because of the length of this coat, we're going to add a vent or a kick pleat. I positioned my opening 13 centimeters down from my low hip. I measured out 5 centimeters or 2 inches from the center back for the width of my kick pleat, connecting this at the hem and the top of the kick pleat. We're going to have an angled line at the top of the kick pleat rather than a right angle. Measure down from the top corner of the kick pleat 3.5 centimeters, 1 inch and 3/8, and connect back to the marking on the center back 13 centimeters, 5 inches down from the low hip. This is the top angle of the kick pleat. Now that we have the kick pleat or the vent drawn on, we're going to mark the pattern because we don't need to cut this shape on both of our back pattern pieces. The kick pleat needs to be cut for the back right pattern piece, and I'm going to mark this and draw around where you're going to be cutting in red. The back left pattern piece doesn't need to have this extension, so you're simply going to be cutting down the straight center back line, and I'm going to mark that for you in green. The grey line for this pattern piece can be parallel to the centre back. Now we've got our base master pattern for our back ready to go. To add the Raglan design details to the back, I'm going to measure 4 centimeters, 1.5 inches from the centre back neck along the neckline and mark that in blue. I added my back armhole notches to my back armhole, measuring up from the underarm for 3 inches and 3.25 inches, 7.5 centimeters and 8 centimeters. I then used my French curve to curve from the mark on the neckline down to the notches for the sleeve. This is the Raglan shape that I used on my garment. Of course, you're welcome to amend this design detail, and I'm marking this in blue so that it's clear for you to see. Now that we have our back pattern finalized, we're going to move on to our front pattern. The first thing that you need to consider with your front pattern is the location and placement of the dart. But your pattern might have the bulk of the dart at the waist, in the middle of the shoulder, or where the shoulder and neckline meet. I would recommend moving those darts into your side dart so that you can follow my technique. To remove my side dart from this pattern to create a pattern without a bust dart, I'm going to cut along the bottom side dart leg. When I get to the bust apex, I will cut straight along my bust line to the center front. Once I've separated this upper part of my front pattern, I'm then going to be able to remove the dart. Align the center front line until the side dart has been completely removed. Once happy, tape in place. By removing our side dart from the pattern, we have also removed some of the length that goes with the side dart for going over the bust line. In a long coat like this, you shouldn't notice too much of an issue by doing this. The next step is to add some length to your front pattern. I'm going to extend my center front line, and I could then work to complete my A-line shaping, just like we did for the back. But to speed up that process, we can actually copy the side seam shape from our back pattern. Once you've extended the center front line of your front, you can then lay your front pattern onto your back pattern. It's going to be hard for you to see through my paper because I'm working with a thicker printer paper for these half-scale patterns to my usual pattern drafting paper. However, I'm aligning my waistlines. I want to make sure that the waistline on the front and the back pattern should be directly on top of one another. The side seam point for that original waistline must also be on top of one another. My front pattern is larger than my back pattern. So when I pierce through my paper and I've aligned the waistlines and that side seam point of the original waistline, I will find that my center front will extend beyond my center back by approximately 1 centimeter, a half an inch. You need to make sure that the center front and the center back are also parallel to one another, and that same distance, 1 centimeter or half an inch, exists all the way down the length of the pattern. Once you have the center front and center back lines parallel, the correct distance between the two lines all the way down through the pattern, and your waistline matched up and your side seam waist point matched, we can then work to copy the back pattern onto the front. You can trace the hem of the back onto the front, as well as that side seam where we've extended the side seam by the 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches to increase the ease in the garment. I will need to add a little bit of extra paper onto the side seam of my front in order to do this, and mark the underarm point from the back onto the front of the garment. Now you can remove your back pattern and turn your front pattern to the right side facing up. Firstly, I'm going to check what I have recorded. I'm going to draw a line that's a right angle to my center front line across the current base of the armhole. I will then lower this by the 4 centimeters, 1.5 inches, to check that that point that I recorded for the back armhole is in the exact same spot, which mine is. Then I can trace on those side seam lines for the back. And I can also double check that these lines drawn on the front are the same increase of ease, 4 centimeters, 1.5 inches from the original lines, and mine are. Connect the marked lines all the way up the side seam and also along the hem. I'm also going to record my bust apex, which is the original bust apex working down from the top of the garment, as this may be useful for fitting. The waist dart can also be marked as void, as I will not be using that in this garment. Now let's move up to the neck edge of the garment, and we're going to follow some of the steps that we did with the back of the pattern. We are going to remove 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch from where the neckline meets the shoulder, the high point shoulder. We are going to raise the shoulder by the 2.5 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch, and we are going to increase our shoulder. Grab your back pattern and check the size of the shoulder that you used on the back. You want the front shoulder to be the same as the back shoulder in this garment, so I will mark that on, and I won't be using my shoulder dart. For the armhole, I'm going to extend my cross front by about 5 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch. I can then work to connect the armhole from the end of the shoulder to the cross front measurement and down from the cross front measurement to the new armhole. Finally, for my front pattern, I'm going to add an extension because I want this coat to be able to overlap. I'm going to add 10 centimeters or 4 inches from the center front, creating a parallel line all the way down the garment. I will then square off at the hem and at the neckline. Use your French curve to draw in the new neckline from the high shoulder point down to the center front neck. The raglan design detail on the front of the garment can be added now or after you've drafted the collar, which we will do next. I positioned my raglan seam in the front of the garment in the middle of my neck, using my French curve to shape this into the armhole notch. My armhole notch is positioned 3 inches, 7.5 centimeters up from the armhole, along the armhole curve. We can now move on to drafting the collar. The first thing that we need to do is to position the roll line onto the front of the garment. I positioned my break point 32.5 centimeters, 12.75 inches down from the neck on the extension line. The break point is the bottom of the lapel. I extended my shoulder seam by 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters for the roll line at the neck edge and connected from the extended shoulder down to the break point. This is the roll line for the front of the garment. To work out the size and shape of the collar that you like, I usually fold the front of the garment back along my roll line. Use a tracing wheel to score the paper if you need to. Using a piece of pattern drafting paper, I'm going to trace on the lapel, the roll line, the neckline, and the shoulder. This will allow me to fold the piece of paper along the roll line and to view the lapel shape as it will be positioned on the final garment. I'm going to draw my lapel on so that it's nice and clear for you. You do not need to use a separate piece of paper like I've done here. I've done this because my half-scale pattern is printed on printer paper, which makes it thick and harder to see through, especially for this video. However, if you're wanting to play around with the design of the collar and lapel, it can be a good idea to play on a separate piece of paper prior to recording those details onto your master pattern. I'm going to share the figures that I did to draft my collar and lapel. You're welcome to change these as required. I did not change the front corner of my lapel shape, and I measured back from this front corner 9 centimeters, 3.5 inches, and placed a mark. This is the width of my lapel before it gets sewn onto the collar. I then contemplated the distance between the lapel and the collar. How big a gap do you want? I decided to go with 4.5 centimeters, 1.75 inches. You will also need to decide on the size of the collar at the front. From the connection to the lapel, how long will the collar be? Mine is 8.5 centimeters, 3 inches and 3/8. And the front edge of my collar is a right angle. You are welcome to change all of these components until you have a design that you're happy with. In case you couldn't clearly see through my paper, I will draw on the neckline, which will be a seam between the collar and the front of the garment. Position a notch on both the collar side and the garment front side. Once you're happy with the shape and size of your collar and lapel, it needs to be marked onto your master pattern. If you're working on the master pattern, you will need to fold your rolled line back and trace your markings to what is the right side of the paper. If you're working on a separate piece of paper, you will need to record those same markings onto the master pattern, like I've done here. We're going to continue drafting the collar, moving up to add the back neckline. So I need to add a piece of paper to extend my front garment. The first step is to build ourselves a guideline that we can use to record other markings from. Extend the center front of the garment with a dotted line. Where the center front meets the high point of the shoulder, this is where the neck and the shoulder will meet on your garment, not the extension for the roll line. You will draw a right angle of a dotted line from the center front line to meet the high point shoulder. Using the dotted guidelines to ensure that this line is parallel to the center front and at a right angle to the horizontal dotted line, you're going to want to draw a line from the high point shoulder away from the center front neckline towards what would be the back of the garment. This line is going to have your back neckline measurement placed onto it. Measure your back neckline using a tape measure and record this measurement onto this line from the high point of shoulder away from the front. Once the back neck measurement is marked, you want to mark another mark 1 centimeter, 3/8 inch further up the line, away from the front. You need to draw another line where the back neck was marked, squaring off the line at a right angle, away from the center front, towards the side seam. This line should measure 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. You can then connect from the high point of shoulder to the end of the 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter line. This is the line for the back neck of the collar. The next line that we're going to draw is the center back of the collar. This line should go from the end of the 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter line through the points on the back neckline that increase the back neckline by 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch and extend at this angle. Decide on the size for the back of the collar. I'm working with a collar that measures 4 inches or 10 centimeters. Mark that on and use your ruler to square from the center back of the collar a mark for approximately 1 centimeter, 3/8 inch. This is to ensure that we don't have a dip at the center back collar. You can now connect from the front of the collar to the back of the collar. Use a French curve if required. The master pattern for this collar is pretty much done. The final thing that we need to do is to extend the shoulder line through the collar, and I'm going to draw mine as a dotted line. Before we trace off the collar from our master pattern, we can add the roll line. Now there is a formula to follow for the roll line position. Take the center back of the collar and divide this by 5. Take this figure and times it by 3 for the fall of the collar and 2 for the stand of the collar. So with your 5 parts, you have 3 above the roll line and 2 below the roll line. Above the roll line is the fall of the collar, below the roll line will be the stand of the collar. For my collar that measures 10 centimeters or 4 inches, the measurement from the back neck to the roll line is 4 centimeters, 1 inch and 5/8. This is the stand, and from the roll line to the outside edge of the collar is 6 centimeters, 2 inches and 3/8. This is the fall. I will be measuring up from the centre back neck 4 centimetres, 1 inch and 5/8, marking the roll line for the collar. Square off the centre back at a right angle for about 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. Use a French curve to connect this back into the roll line marked on the front of the pattern. Now the master pattern for your collar is complete, you're going to want to trace the collar off. Using a piece of pattern paper, draw around the collar, the front edge, the neckline edge of the front and the back, the centre back of the collar. Position a notch where the collar will disconnect from the lapel and the outside edge of the collar. We already marked that on the pattern. And also add a notch where the shoulder line is. You should also trace the dotted line marked on the collar from the shoulder towards the outside edge, as well as the roll line. Now we're going to do one more thing to our collar pattern prior to finalising it. Cut along the drawn shoulder extension line from the outside edge of the collar to the neck edge where you have the notch. Cut to, but not through at the neck edge. Cut from the edge of the paper to the notch at the neck edge. This will create a pivot point. You will then be able to open up the outside edge of the collar, pivoting at the neck edge, creating a dart-like shape. You want to add approximately half an inch, 1.2 centimetres, into the outside edge of the collar. Connect the outside edge of the collar, and I'm going to draw back in line. This is our final master pattern for our collar. You're welcome to use this pattern in a sample to check the fit, shape and size of the collar. Usually the next step would be to separate this pattern piece into an upper collar and an under collar. However, due to the type of fabric that we're using for our coat, we're only going to be cutting this in one layer. But to improve the fit, we're going to separate it at the roll line, creating a pattern piece for the fall and the stand, separated by the roll line. To improve the fit of the collar, we're going to divide the roll line into 4 parts. Draw 3 lines parallel to the centre back. Trace out the 2 separate pattern pieces, the fall of the collar and the stand of the collar. Record the 3 lines that are parallel to the centre back on the fall and the stand. Take the collar stand and cut down each of the 3 lines from the roll line edge to the neck edge, leaving a pivot point at the neck edge. Remove 2 millimeters, scant 1/8 of an inch, from each of the 3 lines at the roll line edge. Tape in position. As you can see here, my collar stand has had 2 millimeters, a scant 1/8 of an inch, removed from each of the 3 lines along the roll line edge, with no adjustment made to the neckline edge. I've also labelled the back as the centre back. This reduction will make the roll line, the join between the collar stand and the fall of the collar, sit closer towards the neck of the body. For the fall of the collar, I've also labelled the centre back. The 3 lines on the fall of the collar need to be cut from the outside edge towards the roll line. This will allow my collar to sit more freely on the outside edge. It does depend slightly on the thickness of the material that you're working with. This will allow you to open up the 3 lines along the outside edge of the collar. I'm going to add in 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch into each of the 3 lines. In order for my collar stand to be able to sew onto the fall of the collar, I'm actually going to need to reduce the fall of the collar slightly, because my collar stand has had 2 millimeters removed in 3 areas. Whatever you've removed from the collar stand needs to be removed at the centre back of the fall of the collar, and we will do this parallel to the centre back, keeping the reduction all of the way through. This means that the collar stand and the fall of the collar will now sew together along the roll line, and the reduction of that 6 millimeters at the outside edge has been neutralised by the amount that I've added in, 3 centimeters, 1 inch and 1/8. And here you have it, your finished pattern pieces for the fall and for the stand. Ensure that your notches are marked on both pattern pieces. It's also a good idea to true the 2 pieces together along the roll line to check that they will sew together exactly. We will add seam allowances to these pattern pieces, and I will also create an entire piece, as at the moment they would have to be cut on the fold. We will do that shortly when we finalise our patterns. The next step is to draft the sleeve pattern. You're going to want to begin by either drafting a new sleeve that works with your adjusted pattern, or by amending the sleeve that went with your block. I'm going to be working with a sleeve pattern that was designed to fit my original block, as I'm imagining that more of you will be working with this. Now we need to treat this sleeve pattern with the same adjustments that we made to our block. We're going to need to increase the sleeve at the underarm by the same amount that we increased the side seam of our bodice block by. This was a total amount of 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches. We're going to extend our bicep line by 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches on both sides, the front and the back of the sleeve. Now, we don't need to increase the sleeve all the way down the underarm seams by this same amount. We only need this amount of increase where the sleeve is going to be joining into the armhole of the body. So for the wrist of your sleeve, you can choose what works for you. I made the wrist of my coat 30 centimeters or 12 inches. Take the total amount of the wrist, use the central line on your sleeve to measure out half towards the back and half towards the front. You may wish to change the length of the pattern, especially if you're planning to wear a jacket or another garment underneath your coat, and you want your coat sleeve to be longer than those underneath. If you wish to do this, you can simply lower your wrist line. I would aim for something like 1 centimeter or half an inch. However, I didn't increase the length of my sleeve because I was happy with the length my sample came out. To draft our coat, we also lowered the underarm, so we're going to need to make that same adjustment to the sleeve as well. Now, I lowered my underarm by 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches. So I'm going to do exactly the same to the sleeve at both ends of the bicep line, squaring off the bicep line at the back and at the front. Then you can connect the underarm seam of your sleeve for the back and the front, connecting from what is the new bicep line to the new wrist line. Draw in the new bicep line. To continue with the sleeve draft, we're going to need to trace out the shoulder and raglan area of the front and back patterns. Using a scrap piece of pattern drafting paper, I'm going to trace out the elements of the front raglan pattern. This involves the raglan, the neckline, the shoulder, and the armhole. I recommend recording the notch for the armhole onto this pattern, even if your raglan doesn't extend quite that far. And it's usually a good idea to label the sleeve versus the neckline, as well as the fact that this is the pattern front. The same applies for the back pattern. You're going to want to trace out the shoulder, the neckline edge, armhole, and the raglan. Record the sleeve notches, label the neck and the sleeve edge, and the fact that this is the back pattern. You can then cut these patterns out along the drawn lines. It's a good idea to try and leave a little bit of paper around where those notches for the armhole are, just so that they're clear on our final pattern. Before we attach the raglan pieces onto the sleeve, we're going to want to record the underarm shape from the bodice block onto the sleeve pattern, from the notches to the base of the underarm. The easiest way to do this is to lay the sleeve on top of the bodice pattern and line the underarm seam of the sleeve with the side seam of the garment. Ensure that the bicep line is parallel to any horizontal lines you have on your bodice block. You're then going to want to trace through or use a tracing wheel to record the shape from that underarm seam up to the notches in the back of the sleeve. I will then take my front pattern and do exactly the same, recording from the side seam up to the single notch on the front underarm onto my sleeve pattern, laying the sleeve pattern on top of the front bodice pattern, matching the underarm and the side seam together, keeping the bicep line parallel to any horizontal lines on the pattern, and recording that armhole shape. I can then draw those shapes onto my sleeve pattern. I'm going to do this with a dotted line for now, because we will probably need to redo it when we true our armhole later on. We're now going to take our 2 raglan pattern pieces. Align the back raglan piece with the back sleeve, the front raglan piece with the front sleeve. Make sure that you have the sleeve edge of the raglan against the sleeve, not the neck edge. You want to match up the back and the front raglans at the notch on your sleeve. This might be in the center of your sleeve, this might be a little bit closer to the front, like mine is here. We're going to create a dart with the dart opening between the neck edges of the back and the front raglan pieces. This creates a dart instead of a shoulder seam. The gap between my front and back raglan pieces at the neck edge is 10 centimeters, 4 inches. And this worked best for me to get a sleeve shape that was fitted, but also created enough movement. The larger the dart you have at the top of the sleeve, the more structured the shape of your shoulder can be. However, this can limit movement. As well as matching up the raglan pieces at the shoulder notch at the top of the sleeve, you also need to ensure a nice smooth join down the raglan seam into the sleeve. If you gain or lose a little bit over the top of the sleeve cap, it isn't usually a problem. Once you're happy, tape the raglan pieces in place. Of course, you may find that you don't get the same results that I do because your bespoke pattern is going to be different to my block. Just work to get something as similar as possible and create a sample to check. Once you're happy, you can draw things in to finalize it. I'm going to draw in what was my shoulder seams to create my dart at the shoulder. Check the measurement of the dart legs match. I'm then going to need to true the raglan shape of the sleeve onto the body. Using the edge of a tape measure, measure the raglan seam for the front of the sleeve. Measure the raglan seam on the front bodice. Compare the two measurements. We want the measurements to be the same. We don't want to have any ease in this seam. You will probably find that you need to tweak the sleeve seam to meet the bodice. This may mean extending or decreasing the bicep line. You may even find that you need to tweak the position of your raglan pattern pieces on the top of the sleeve. For my pattern, I had to decrease the bicep line. If you make any changes to this area, you will need to once again true the shape of the underarm from the bodice onto the sleeve pattern. Position the sleeve on top of the bodice and trace on the shape. Redraw the shape onto the front of the sleeve. You can then finalize the entire raglan shape of the sleeve seam. Ensure that your notches are matching. You're welcome to true the patterns on top of one another if you like. Once you're happy with the front, you will do exactly the same thing for the back. You will need to measure the back raglan seam of the sleeve. Compare this to the back raglan seam of the back of the coat. Amend your sleeve with any changes, and then redraw the underarm shape onto the sleeve if needed, continuing to finalize the entire back raglan seam. It can be a little bit of a process to get the patterns to true together, as well as keep the bicep the size that you need and the dart at the top of the sleeve in a shape that works for you. Because I've adjusted the underarm seam of my sleeve, I'm going to need to redraw from my bicep line to my wrist line on the front and the back of the pattern. One thing to check is that the bicep of your sleeve is going to be large enough for your body. I would measure the bicep of your sleeve and check that you're happy with this. If your bicep needs to be larger, you may find that you need to adjust your coat front and back pattern pieces in order for them to fit the sleeve. I'm also going to draw in my elbow line here. It's a good idea when you make your sample to draw your elbow line onto the sample to check that it's in the right place. To improve the fit of the sleeve, I added an elbow dart to the back seam. Measure down from the elbow line on the back underarm seam the width of your dart. Usually I do a 1 centimeter, half an inch dart, but for this garment I did a 2 centimeter, 3/4 of an inch dart. Measure and mark this amount below the elbow line. Measure the length of the dart along the elbow line. Mine was 12 centimeters or 5 inches. Draw the dart in place. To ensure the underarm seams of the sleeve are the same length once the elbow dart has been sewn, you will need to extend the back sleeve seam by the amount of the elbow dart. Reconnect the wrist line back to the front underarm seam. To finalize the sleeve pattern, we're going to move the wrist towards the front of the garment. This is because our arm doesn't hang straight on our body. Below the elbow, kicks out towards the front. Along the wrist line, move the back seam and the front seam 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch towards the front. Reconnect the new wrist position up to the elbow line. The grain line will be positioned in the center of the sleeve, at a right angle to the elbow and bicep. The elbow dart can be trued by folding the dart bulk towards the hem of the sleeve. Use a tracing wheel to record the side seam. And there you have it, your finished sleeve pattern. I'm going to draw over my finished sleeve pattern in red so that you can clearly see the finished sleeve markings. Before we finalize our patterns, trace them off and add our seam allowances, we need to create a few more corresponding pattern pieces. One of those is the belt and also the belt loops. Let's start by drafting the belt pattern. The belt pattern is a long rectangle, and I'm drawing this at smaller than half size so that it fits onto my screen. You do not have to make a pattern piece for the belt if you want to simply draw this onto your fabric in chalk. My belt measures in width 6.5 centimeters, which is 2.5 inches. The length of my belt is 2.3 meters, 90.5 inches, or 2.5 yards. Depending on your fabric width and the type of fabric that you're working with, if your fabric has a nap, then you will probably want to position the short edge of the belt parallel to the grain line on your fabric. You may need to add a center back seam to the belt, in which case you would simply cut the pattern piece in half and add a seam allowance at the center back. This is what I had to do with my material. Once you've designed your belt and you know the width of your belt, you can then mark the belt loops and their placement onto the side seam of your pattern. Working with the front side seam, I'm going to position my top belt loop in line with the waist. If you prefer, you can center your belt loop over your waist. It's up to you. I then measured down my belt loop width plus 1/4 of an inch or 5 millimeters for ease. So I will measure down 7 centimeters, 2 3/4 inches to mark my second belt loop. And both of these marks can be notches. I will do exactly the same on the back of my pattern so that the notches exist on this pattern as well. The belt loop pattern is going to measure 1 centimeter in width, 3/8 of an inch by 8 centimeters in length, approximately 3 inches. Finally, we're going to draw the pocket onto the front of the garment. I positioned my pocket 3 centimeters, 1.25 inches from the side seam, 14 centimeters, 5.5 inches down from the waistline, and approximately 16 centimeters, 6.25 inches away from the front extension. The pocket itself in size is 20 centimeters, 8 inches in width, 27.5 centimeters, 10.5 inches in length. Now we have finished drafting our patterns. The next step is that you're going to want to trace off your patterns from your master pattern. Lay on a piece of your pattern drafting paper and trace out firstly the stitching line, as well as the grain lines and any notches. You're then going to want to add your seam allowances, which if you're working to create an unlined coat from a double-faced splittable fabric, you're going to want to add a small seam allowance of 5 millimeters, 1/4 inch. And you would add this seam allowance everywhere, including at the hem of the garment. You can then cut out and label your pattern pieces. Let's chat through each pattern piece to ensure that you have everything you need in order to make a successful garment. For all patterns, it's a good idea to label the pattern with a name of your choosing. I'm calling mine Unlined Coat. It's also usually a good idea to add a date, as well as to write the name of the block or the person that you've drafted this for. Label the pattern piece with what it is. This is the front, as well as how many pattern pieces you're planning on cutting. I have got to cut 2 in this pattern, but they need to be 2 opposites. One with this side of the pattern facing up and one with the other side of the pattern facing up. The terminology for this is to cut 1 pair. However, you're welcome to write cut 1 pair or cut 2 in fabric, whatever makes sense to you. You also need to record the seam allowance that you've used. I'm working with 5 millimeters or 1/4 inch. Trace around the master pattern for the front and add your seam allowances. You will then want to mark your key notches. For the front pattern, it's the notches for the belt loops, the notch for the front raglan, the notch for the collar, and it's usually a good idea to record your roll line as well as the center front line. Finally, I have some markings for my pocket placement. Make sure that you have your grain line on your pattern piece, and this can either have 2 arrows, one at either end, or you can choose to put 1 arrow. This can be useful if you're working with a material that has a nap. The arrow will go in the direction of the nap. Then you can work to create the pocket pattern piece. You will trace this out around the stitching line, add your seam allowances, and label it accordingly. This is your pocket, and you will be cutting 2 in fabric. You do not need to write cut 1 pair because the pocket is symmetrical. Next up, you have your back pattern piece, which again will be a copy of the master pattern. Trace around this and add your seam allowances as required. On my block, I have 2 lines that I can use as my center back, a straight line and a shaped line. I have used the shaped line on my coat. If you don't have this marked on your block and you want to use this on your pattern, you're going to want to measure in 1 centimeter, 3/8 inch at the waist, and connect back up to your cross back and about 2 inches, 5 centimeters above the low hip. Now you can use the same pattern for your left back and your right back. I would simply need to trace out my left back and add a seam allowance and do the same for the right back with the extension. And you will fold back the right extension when you cut out your left back. If you want to use one pattern for both pattern pieces, then you will mark on one side your right back and you will mark on the other side the left back. Alternatively, you can draw 2 pattern pieces, one for the left back and one for the right back, and it will be cut 1 in fabric for both pattern pieces. Finally, on the back pattern, you should have 2 notches for your belt loops at the side seam and a double notch for the join to the sleeve at the raglan seam. As with the other patterns, the sleeve pattern will be traced off from the master sleeve, and seam allowances will be added. And you will need to cut 1 pair in fabric. As the dart at the shoulder of the sleeve is very large, you can simply add seam allowances to your stitching lines to create a cutaway dart. For the dart at the elbow, you can add seam allowances here, but it's probably easier just to have some dart bulk that will be trimmed away during the sewing process. Of course, you should have notches for the front raglan and a double notch for the back raglan, and your raglan seams should be trued to the front and back raglan on the body. It is useful to position a notch on what is the front underarm seam of the sleeve at the elbow line. This needs to align with the sewn dart at the back of the sleeve, and both underarm seams should be the same length. It's worthwhile truing them to double check. Moving on to the collar pattern piece, we have our main collar, which is a traced pattern of the collar fall that we drafted earlier. The collar fall ended at the centre back, so I've duplicated the pattern for the second side. This allows me to have one pattern piece where I only need to cut one collar in my fabric. I've copied the notch from the collar fall pattern onto my main collar pattern, and I've also added my 5mm 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. When it comes to the grain line for this pattern piece, if you have a material that has a nap, you're going to want to make sure that the nap of the fabric goes through the collar from the inside or neck side to the outside edge of the collar. I will mark the direction in red. Then we have our collar band, which is a copy of the collar stand pattern that we drafted earlier. Once again, I haven't finished this pattern at the centre back. I have duplicated it for the second side so that I can cut one in fabric. The nap grain line for the collar band will go towards the neck seam. I have copied the shoulder notch from my collar stand pattern onto this pattern piece, and I've also added a couple of other notches. The position of the notches will help you to align the collar band onto the neckline of the garment. The first notch is placed the distance from the centre back to the back raglan seam, and you can position this by measuring or truing the collar band onto the garment pattern pieces. The next notch is the position of what was the shoulder seam, which is going to be the dart in the sleeve. Then you have the distance from the shoulder dart in the sleeve to the front raglan seam, where you would position another notch on the collar band. And then the distance from the collar band to the next notch on the garment will encompass the collar band and the collar, with the notch marked onto the collar. Of course, the garment pattern pieces have had the raglan seam trued between the sleeve and the body, and by marking these notches, you can be truing the neck seam of the collar onto the garment. It's also a good idea to true the seam between the collar band and the collar together. And finally, we have our belt pattern piece. Now, your belt pattern may be in one part, it may be in two parts with a centre back seam. This simply depends on the width of your fabric. As I mentioned when we were drafting the belt, if you prefer, you can just draw this onto your fabric. You don't need to have a pattern. If you have a nap in your fabric, the grain line for the belt wants to be going through the belt from the top of the belt to the bottom of the belt. The belt has a 1/4 inch 5mm seam allowance all the way around. And if you had two, you could label them as your back right belt and your back left belt. Both would be cut one in the fabric. If you have one belt, it would just be cut one in the fabric. Now, the final pattern piece that you will need to have is a belt loop pattern piece. This pattern piece has 5mm or a 1/4 inch down both of the long edges, but this is the only pattern piece that has a slightly different seam allowance on the short edges. I increased the seam allowance here from 5mm to 1.5 centimeters. 5/8 of an inch. This is because of how I will sew the belt loop onto the coat to create a neat finish. The grain line for the belt loop will be going down through the length, parallel to the long edge, from the top to the bottom. And here you have it, your final set of patterns, with the details, notches, and grain lines as required. The next step is to take your pattern and to begin the cutting out process. Join me in the next video where I go through the sewing and construction for this garment. Alternatively, take the pattern and go and make a coat using a different method, in which case you're welcome to add different seam allowances and details as you need. Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this class and you learned some new pattern drafting techniques. Join me in the next one for sewing the coat.